All right, well, welcome everybody. It is 6 o'clock and I am going to go ahead and get started. Want to welcome everybody to the spring webinar series. I am the host of the webinar series and also tonight's presenter, but I'm the chair of the webinar committee and I'm also the incoming president. Right now I'm the president-elect of the Michigan Council for Social Studies. We are really excited to have all of you here at our inaugural webinar series. Michigan Council for Social Studies is excited to offer this first round as free for both members and non, so we've got both MCSS members and non-members on tonight. We are, for those of you who don't know, a content organization that serves hundreds of teachers across the state at the elementary, middle, and high school level, and we have really strong partnerships with a variety of different organizations, including universities, ISDs, and other social studies related professional organizations around the state. So while these are definitely free for everybody, we do always want to encourage membership. So we encourage you to visit our website at www.mcssmi.org and click on the Join Us button. Your $40 a year membership gets you a discounted rate to our annual statewide conference, and next school year, access to even more webinars like these, as well as other amazing resources like our twice a year Journal Plus, some partner offerings, and next year we're even hoping to be offering some sketch-based training opportunities, both online and potentially in person. So definitely want to think about becoming an MCSS member if you're not, but whether you are or not, we welcome you and are glad that you're here tonight. Did want to take just a minute to thank our partner organizations who helped us get this webinar series going. A couple of weeks ago, we had the Genocide Education Project here, and the recap video for theirs is up on the MCSS website. And last week we took off, but the week before that we had the Michigan Geographic Alliance, and they talked about geography-based education and how to do it in the digital landscape. And then this week is being brought to you by Northern Michigan Learning Consortium, which is where I work, and it's a collection of 10 intermediate school districts in Northern Michigan. And next week, we'll be finishing off with a variety of partners, including the Ottawa Area Intermediate School District, and that's an ISD that services a large geographic region in West Michigan. All of our partners have provided us with the learning opportunities we've been exploring this spring, and we greatly appreciate everything they've done. Few quick ground rules before we begin. If you've not already done so, take a moment to mute your microphones while the speakers are talking. Even if you aren't talking, paper shuffling around on a desk, opening and closing drawers, all of that stuff. My daughter is making dinner right now, so I'm sure you're going to hear the microwave beep. That can affect the sound for everybody, so just stay muted. And if you have a question at any point in time for myself, who's the presenter this evening, please feel free to throw your questions and comments in the chat box. I've got it up, and Adam, our president, also has it up. And so if there's time in line during the presentation, we'll ask them, and there will be some time for Q&A at the very end. So this is Adapting Inquiry for Blended Learning, and it is the fourth of our spring webinar series. We're going to conclude next week with two back-to-back webinars. One that talks about skills-based education called The Second Dimension, going where few men and women have gone before. And that's how you can really marry some C3 skills with your Michigan content expectations in the classroom. And especially for our elementary teachers, we've got an offering, a roundtable called Rock It, Don't Knock It, Become a Third Grade MVP. And so if you've got a third grade teacher in your life, make sure that they know about that one because it's going to be really cool. We've got a renowned geographer, a renowned historian, and then a renowned teacher, all going to talk about how to best teach third grade social studies and Michigan history. So it should be a lot of fun. So this is me. This is a headshot of me from a musical that I was in this past fall where I played Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. The day after this picture was taken, I shaved my head for the part. You know, 12 weeks without a haircut at this point in quarantine. I'm wishing for the Fester look again right now. But I taught social studies and English in a computer lab setting from 2003 through 2011. Now think about the 2003 part. This was well before Google Classroom was a thing. This is actually well before Google Docs was a thing. I did things with Microsoft OneNote that I don't think the creators of Microsoft OneNote know it can do. But I taught in this computer lab for about almost 10 years before moving to the ISD world, where I've been ever since. I'm the social studies consultant for every intermediate school district in Northern Michigan, so I get around a lot. And looking in the participant list, I recognize many, many names. So I'm excited to be here with all of you tonight. I was also a member of the Teacher Collaborative Council, which was a group of educators from around the country that reviewed different drafts of the C3 framework while it was in development. And I was most recently a standards writer for Michigan Social Studies Standards, and just concluded my time as project coordinator for the Michigan State Social Studies Standards Professional Development Collaboration. So been around in the social studies world through a variety of lenses, and I'm going to share some knowledge and expertise with you guys tonight about blending your social studies instruction for either a blended or remote learning. So this presentation tonight is essentially a presentation over a project that started off as a reactionary response to COVID-19 and the remote learning situation that we all found ourselves in. And congratulations, it's June. Level up 6 for Jumanji. But being June, it means we've reached the end of this grand experiment, and none of us know what's going to happen next year yet. But I'm hopeful that this presentation will provide you with some tools and tips that will, no matter what situation you find yourself in, will serve you well. But when we went home for those first 3 weeks, a lot of people felt like we'd serve that 3-week period of time and be back. I was not in that camp. It felt like something bigger. So while every district up here was doing something different for the first part of the closure, I felt like, gosh, this is a really good time to really hunker down on social studies and figure out, particularly at the elementary level, but not just there, everywhere, how can we make sure that social studies does not take a back seat to everything else the rest of this year, when the announcement inevitably comes, that inevitably came, that schools were going to fully close. So for those first 3 weeks, I worked in conjunction with a ton of books. All of these guys, which are also listed on the slideshow here, but these are my social studies nerd Bibles that have really been what I have learned, everything I've learned about inquiry from that and classroom observation. And so I took those books and I really studied them, and I reached out to some of my best teachers from around my zone to try and think out a way that we could best encourage districts to include social studies in their remote learning plans. That's where this whole project started. And every one of the books and the images on the slide was dissected and studied in the hopes that I could find a way to help teachers figure out the best way to meet the needs of remote learning. So I created a document, which I will share in the chat in just a moment, that outlines that whole 3-week brainstorm session in its most basic form. But as time went on, I sort of remembered that come some point next school year, whether it's the fall or after, we're going to return to schools. Schools that may end up with more technology in the hands of teachers and the kids than they had before. So while this was initially targeted to help schools figure out how to make the best of a bad situation by switching to some form of remote learning for the remainder of the year, I also realized that this has implications for future school years as well. So I sat down to figure out how we might practice the powerful art of inquiry in a classroom where students have access to devices. So this is the document that I was referencing. Some of you guys may have seen it. Again, I'm going to drop the link to this in the chat at some point here. I thought I had it on my PowerPoint slide, but I do. So I will put it in a link to this in the chat in just a minute. But it kind of outlines the introduction to everything and then goes into what I'm going to go into more detail on tonight. So this document is freely available, and it went out to my groups and a few other groups, and if you've seen it, I hope you have found it useful, because that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to grab the link and I'm going to drop it in the chat so that everyone here can have access to that same document. So in a nutshell, what I'm going to say tonight is really contained in that bottom sentence on this slide. It's my hope that by the time we're done, you leave with some ideas of how you might blend, flip, or teach some of your social studies content remotely. A quick disclaimer. I already mentioned that this document originated under distress. So while it is rooted in research and it's rooted in collaboration with other educators, it is by no means the be-all end-all of teaching remotely or blending your classroom and social studies. We'll have some time for questions and comments at the end, but feel free to add ideas that you've tried, solutions that you've had, questions that you have to the chat throughout. Adam's going to monitor it throughout the presentation. And I will pause at the end of each main idea for some of those questions to be asked. So I'm certain that we're going to hear and learn more about using inquiry to effectively teach social studies skills and contents from a ton of experts, no matter how we end up teaching in the fall. So to kick this off, I wanted to very quickly make sure that everyone understands the distinction between blended learning and everything else. So the thing I want to make sure to point out that there's a ton of terms in ed tech and not all of them necessarily mean the same thing. So the definition of blended learning in a formal education program is something that it's at least in part through online learning with some elements of student control over time, place, path, pace, etc. And at least part of it is also taking place in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home. So there's a ton of modalities along each student's learning path within a course or subject that are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. And I really feel that inquiry, social studies inquiry, is very well set up for this. So, and then there's remote learning, which is what we've all just been done. Maybe there are online components, maybe there aren't. There's no clear, concise definition for remote learning that I've come across, but it has to take into consideration students with and without devices. Now, that's not to say you don't have to take student devices and access into account with blended learning as well. You absolutely do. But remote learning like that, which we're emerging out of right now, is a different animal altogether. And I'm going to try to tackle both of these things. So inquiry is part of our standards now. And it is published in our standards document as the first portion of said document. And the C3 arc of inquiry is broken into 4 dimensions, which come across as asking questions, using disciplinary tools and concepts, evaluating sources and using evidence, and communicating conclusions and taking informed action. And some of you have seen something like this that's up on the screen right now. This is an IDM, and it stands for Inquiry Design Module. And this is how a lot of C3 inquiries end up getting presented to people. So C3 are national level inquiry standards that are part of Michigan state standards. And so they define skills and we define the content. So this is an example of a completely filled in inquiry, what the opening page looks like. You can see that it's got a question and that there are supporting questions and tasks that students are doing along the way, and lots of different sources. And then at the very bottom, you've got a summative performance task that you do at the end of the whole thing. And there could be some options for taking informed action, which is an opportunity to go beyond what you've studied in the classroom overall. So an IDM you can find at a variety of places, but I'm going to be using a lot of my examples tonight from this particular one, which is highlighted in the document as well in certain places. And actually not this one, it's on the next slide. This is another example of a title page for one. So while C3 framework is divided into 4 dimensions, I'm going to talk about 6 steps to moving them to a blended or remote learning situation. And the steps are listed here. You start by posing the question, you unpack the tasks, you explore the supporting questions, you analyze the sources, you give them an opportunity to argue their answer, and then communicate their conclusions. So a compelling question is what kicks one off. There are 2 major components in a compelling question. And the first is that they've got to be intellectually meaty. And that means a lot of things, but essentially in breaking that apart, we need to make sure that a student can argue multiple answers when they're done with it. And it should be heavy. There's a whole process that goes into building a compelling question and their corresponding set of supporting questions, which I'm going to boil down in a nutshell. You start by analyzing your content for an inquiry, a big chunk of your content, and then figure out from that content a smaller idea that you can delve into and spend some time on. You then draft a compelling question, which is stress test, and in the stress test, the author envisions multiple plausible arguments that a student might come up with. If distinctly different arguments can be made, it probably passed the stress test and the author's moved into future stages of IDM design. You can assume that most of the ones that you're going to come across on sites like C3 Teachers, which I'll show you in a minute, and the Northern Michigan Inquiry Hub, those will have already passed the stress test. I just want to make sure you understand the purpose of a compelling question. The second piece, however, is absolutely critical. It has to be student friendly. It has to be free of teacher jargon. Nothing can get a kid out of out of the inquiry zone faster than a question that is just weighed down with all of these extra words. So it has to inspire and ignite inquiry in students. And after many conversations with the authors of the C3 framework about this very topic, I like to say, think of it as a poem. It's the smallest, most concise number of words you can use to get your point across. So when it comes to research, I'm not always a person to take the work of another and make additional leaps. Student-friendly is a really broad term, and that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So some demand the context, and the compelling question that we're going to work from here does not necessarily have that context, but the context come in the form of the supporting questions. So a great example that a lot of us in Michigan at the statewide Social Studies Leadership Network have argued over recently comes directly out of the Swan, Lee, and Grant book, which was on that previous slide. And I see that Karen Sims asked if there's a list of the Social Studies nerd books as well. I will definitely make sure that you guys know where to find them. So the question that came out of the books that we've sort of debated a lot is, did the 20s roar? And to me, this is compelling from the student-friendly lens in particular. And I can think about, even though I never taught the high school US history course, I can think about the different components that go into that. But not everyone agrees because they want some of that specificity. So just know that there's a lot of information out there on compelling questions, and a lot of people definitely believe strongly in their beliefs. I always go directly back to the books whenever possible. So as far as where you can find some compelling questions already, I mentioned two places that I'm going to show you right now. You've got the C3 Teachers website, and this is www.c3teachers.org. And what's great about this website is that this is created by the lead writers of the C3 framework. So everything here to me is gospel. And they have a ton of inquiries. If you click on the inquiry button, they've got a ton of inquiries already ready to go. Now, I'm going to warn everyone, your first instinct is probably going to be to go to your grade level. Don't do that, because this is a national level hub. And so not everything directly aligns to how Michigan teaches social studies with our expanding environments model. But what you can do is go over to select topic, and you can see ancient history, European history, Civil War, US government, human rights, huge list. So I'm going to click on economics, and it's going to bring up all of the economics inquiries that they have. And so you can see the main topics, and you can click into each one further, and you can browse, and you can see the compelling question for this one is, how will I make a change? And you're then able to download a PDF or a Word document if you want to make some changes. So the C3 Teachers website is a fantastic one. And then a newer one comes from the Michigan Open Book Project. If you go to textbooks.wmist.org, that website is for the Michigan Open Book Project, which also has compelling questions at a chapter level. But I had my Northern Michigan teachers working on inquiries a few years back, and we created the Northern Michigan Inquiry Hub, which is probably going to end up in a different place later on, but you can go to inquiries and select by topic here as well. And you can see it's a similar setup the further into it you get. So this one right here, Do My Ideas Matter, is the one that we're going to be using as an example tonight. So definitely bookmark and go to both of these places if you're looking for good inquiries, and particularly good questions, good compelling questions. So, all right, so the question that we're going to start with step one, which is posing the question. And the question that you see here aligns to an inquiry from the 8th grade content expectations in Michigan. And it deals with the competing views of Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. And it's centered around the idea, do my ideas matter, which is intellectually meaty and student friendly. And it's up to the classroom teacher to provide the context. But I always recommend starting with the basic question from any perspective or standpoint as a powerful way to bring a student's own interests and their knowledge and their background to the table right from the get-go. In a question like this, students may not know right off the bat that you're talking about Calhoun and Clay and Webster, but they may in fact be able to relate to this question. So my first step would be, whether in person or online, to introduce the compelling question and give students an opportunity to quick write about this. Some suggestions are on the slide. You can pose the question in your learning management system as a warm-up or an activator. You can introduce the compelling question or ask the compelling question as part of a regularly scheduled online meeting if you're teaching remotely. You can email the compelling question to students or email it to parents and ask them to talk it over with their students and have their students record their initial answers on paper. Remotely wise, or even blended wise, have them start a journal, whether paper or digital, and write their answers to this question on the very first day there. You know, for some family interaction, if you want to bring in some social emotional learning, have them interview a family member about their thoughts about what the answer to the question might be. And, you know, a graphic organizer is always a great tool. So when you think about the idea of pre and post testing, I have everything under the sun taking place up here, but there's no research, there's absolutely none that suggests that giving our kids the final exam on the first day as a starting point is an effective way of gauging their knowledge. You already know the end result of that, right? If you know of a teacher that's doing that, you're going to give them your final exam from the end of the semester or the end of the course on the very first day. They're going to spend 30 minutes. It's going to irritate them. They're going to bomb it, and you've wasted their time. But what I love about a compelling question, whether you're in person, remotely, or blended, is that it is a fantastic way to demonstrate students' growth. If they, on the very first day of a unit or an inquiry, answer this question in some way, shape, or form, you know, keep that answer. And then at the end of it, as part of the assessment, where their assessment is to actually write their answer to this question now with all this evidence that they've studied, if you keep that quick write as part of the assessment, you know, you can staple the two together, and I guarantee you're going to see some meaningful growth that wastes neither your time nor your students' time. So how can you do this in a remote or blended setting? It's up here on the screen right now, and I actually kind of want to demonstrate one using a tool called Padlet. So this is another way you can do it if you've got devices in your classroom, or if you have them actually try to answer this question at home on their own. I'm going to throw a Padlet link into the chat right now. And if you go there, as I am about to, and I click on my own link here, you will hopefully see, because I have not tried this out before today, but you will hopefully see Do My Ideas Matter? And I want you to take just a second while I grab a drink of water here to quickly jot down your initial answer to this question. Do a little bit more than yes. Give me a sentence if you're able to. And let's see those notes start to pop up on the screen. Oh, I love it. So I'm seeing my ideas can create ripples that impact other people's ideas and action. I did not write that one, I promise. But what I love about this one is that if I'm already, as the teacher, thinking ahead to the end of this inquiry, whether it's remote, blended, or fully in the classroom, I can totally connect this original thought, this original answer to this question to potential expanded answers that kids are going to have after they've learned about Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. They matter as long as they inform action and or are shared. Amen. My ideas matter when I have the ability to formulate them in a structured way, and generally if the avenue for gaining that feedback is structured. Again, amen. My ideas matter because they cause other people to think about their ideas. All of these are great. All of these are great. And so Padlet, if you've never seen it before, is free. And I believe I am signed in with my Google account. So I believe there's a sign in with Google option for it. And you can use it for lots of different things. I could even see categorizing, as you can see on my screen, hopefully on yours as well. I'm moving stuff around. I'm doing it randomly, but if you're getting similar thoughts, if your kids are answering this question, move them all around into similar veins. Then you've got some discussion groups when you come back into class and discuss this. So, you can say, all right, the people that wrote these notes, I want you guys to get together and talk about this idea a little bit further. And this can be open. Just because I'm going to close this window and go back into my presentation does not mean that this disappears and no one can go into it anymore. It's a pretty cool tool, and it's simple and it's free. So it's one of many different ways that in a blended, remote, or in-person classroom, you can start to launch an inquiry with your students and move them forward. So the other thing that you need to introduce as part of this is that you have a set of supporting questions. And on this, you can see the supporting questions absolutely are listed on this screen. What are the core ideas expressed in antebellum US on the nature of the union among states? How did Calhoun, Clay, and Webster's ideas on the nature of the union among men or on states play out in early political compromises? And how did Calhoun, Clay, and Webster's views on slavery and the nature of the Union of States play out in the debate over the Compromise of 1850? So supporting questions connect to the compelling question. And for a make it interesting a question as possible for a kid kind of guy like me, supporting questions are where you bring that context that you might be missing from a compelling question. And you can definitely see that context in those supporting questions there. So a student will probably be able to give you an answer to the compelling question above, but you're not going to have any luck using supporting questions as a warm-up or activator in a class setting until they've actually studied the content. And I'm looking at the chat and it says that Ed says, be careful with Padlet, as I think they're always anonymous. Totally forgot to mention that. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Frank. Students can sign into it, so you can set up the security settings, because I did not have everybody, I wanted to go the easiest route possible. So thank you for pointing that out. You are absolutely right. The anonymity is a problem unless you take the step to make it something that they're logged into. So supporting questions you find in the same place as compelling questions. You can pull ready-made ones from C3 Teachers or the Northern Michigan Inquiry Hub. And almost all the inquiries out there have both. So once you've posed that compelling question, take some time to actually go through with students what the supporting questions are and what they mean. So I recommend one of the cool new features with Google Classroom is you can set up things under a topic. So I might actually make the compelling question a topic, and then everything underneath it would be subcategorized under the supporting questions, which is really nice. But again, post the supporting questions in your learning management system. And if you are teaching, if you're doing it blended, having them there is probably enough, because you can give that background in class. If you're in a remote setting, I would make sure that you attach a note to each of those supporting questions that kind of break down each one. Letting students know that they aren't supposed to answer them yet. You're going to have the answers to these questions at the end of this inquiry. Don't worry about writing me a four paragraph essay answering each supporting question that you're seeing here. You can also, if you're blended or if you're teaching remotely, you can also unpack the supporting questions as part of a regularly scheduled online check-in. So my wife has been doing those. She's a K-6 special education teacher, and she's meeting with her students on a rotating basis all week. So You could definitely unpack the supporting question as part of an online meeting. You can email the supporting questions again to parents or students with that same note explaining what they are. If I go back to remote for a second, if you're sending work packets home, put a sticky note on each column of the graphic organizer that sort of breaks down what you would have said in either the online meeting or otherwise. Just something to let them know, don't worry about answering these questions specifically, just know that they're going to guide you in the bigger package, which is the next part of the process. When we move into step 2, you actually need to spend some time unpacking the task with students as well. So as we move into the second step, and this can be done in conjunction with posing the question, but it's enough of an abrupt shift that I wanted to make sure that it was its own step as well. And this is the piece of it that is arguably the hardest to do in a remote setting. It's less difficult to do in person or in a blended setting. Students need to understand the question and the context surrounding the question, but they also need to understand the task at the end. And every inquiry, the task on that first page that I showed you earlier has this bottom portion that is set up like this. So it usually says argument, and then it repeats the compelling question. So in this case, do my ideas matter? And then it's boilerplate language, construct an argument, e.g. detailed outline, poster, essay, that addresses the compelling question. And then there's some skills that are dependent upon your grade level. So here in this middle school one, using specific claims and relevant evidence from contemporary sources while acknowledging competing views. If I send that home with a student without any sort of unpacking of what it is that they're going to be expected to do, I'm probably going to get a bunch of emails or phone calls or no work turned in, depending on your students. So let students know that the assessment of learning for this entire task, this entire inquiry, is going to be to answer that compelling question after they have gone through all the sources, and that they can do it in a variety of ways. Now, in a remote, blended, or in-person setting, what are some of those ways? I've got this up here. This is also available in the handout verbatim. I stole the graphics directly from the handout that I made. You can have them submit their assignment in your learning management system, whether it's Google Classroom, Edmodo, anything under the sun. You could also, if you're teaching remotely, or if you have some kids that next year if schools reopen next year, we may have some kids that are home that you may still be doing some remote learning with. So have students present their assignment to the class via a communication tool like Zoom or Google Meet. Zoom probably won't continue to be free in the fall, but Google Meet is part of Google Apps for Education. So that's going to be available and that's going to be free. You can have students bring completed projects to school drop-off, if in the remote setting, if that's an issue. Or my teacher focus group brought this one up. I was thinking forever, like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And it was my teacher group that I worked with that said, well, you could always send a self-addressed stamped envelope to return the project in. So, that's just trying to think out of the box of as many different possibilities. But then what they can actually do, they can create a website, they can write a letter, they can make a digital documentary, they can storyboard a digital documentary if they don't have a device. They can build their presentation to go online, or they can just outline the presentation that they might give. Recording a podcast. All of these this is not an all-inclusive list, but these are just some ideas to get you going of when they go to answer that compelling question at the very end of this as an assessment, what can I do in a remote setting, a blended setting, or in class? So now we're going to move into the sources, which is step 3. So the bulk of an inquiry is to provide students evidence upon which their answer to a compelling question can be built. So evidence in an existing inquiry has been selected by the author of the inquiry in the hopes that it can lead students to any one of numerous potential answers. Good sources really bring inquiry to life, but making those sources accessible for students in a remote setting in particular can be difficult. I mean, primary sources are not things that kids just go and do backflips for when you announce that you're going to read them in your class, right? When you tell your 8th graders, hey, we're looking at the Declaration of Independence today, very few of them are probably going to go, woohoo, yes, Mr. Johnson, awesome, I can't wait. So but they have to read sources as part of an inquiry. There's absolutely no getting around that. So when developing a C3 style inquiry, the inquiry authors generally try to come up with 3 to 5 different answers that a student is likely to argue to make sure that they are balanced and allow for multiple viewpoints to be expressed. That's that stress test that I talked about before. And those sources can help students craft one of those answers. So all of the sources go hand in hand with the supporting questions for each day, as well as the overall compelling question. It's this like beautiful pyramid upon which your answer to the question at the top of the pyramid is founded. So I just invented a new metaphor mid-presentation. That's actually pretty normal for me. So ways to explore the supporting questions. You could provide a video overview of the sources that students will read and analyze. Almost think of it like the old Reading Rainbow had back in the old days, had the kids doing a book review of a children's book that came out. Think of it as the teacher's version of that. So in a blended setting where you're gonna see them every day, that can be part of what they do at home, is view that video, take a look at the sources, and come to class the next day ready to kind of tackle what's in there. And in a remote classroom, that video may be even more important to introducing kids to the structure of this inquiry. So this supporting question, what are the core ideals expressed in antebellum US and the nature of the union among states? At the end of this, I want you to write a 140 character or less tweet announcing the deaths of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, highlight the central idea of each man's viewpoint in the Union, include at least 2 hashtags to indicate core values that they held. And to do this, you're going to get to know Calhoun, Clay, and Webster by doing this quick whiteout activity and reading this article from a Joy Hakeem book that's included as part of the inquiry itself. Now, reading strategies are also very important for your students, and you've probably done a bunch of reading strategies in your classroom, and you probably introduce several of them. So if you can give students a bookmark as a visual reminder or a cue for literacy strategies practiced in class, that's going to help them when they sit down to take a look at these sources. And if you label each source in a remote setting in particular with a suggested date so that students don't feel like, oh man, I have got to take all of these, and read them all at one point in time. Some kids need the structure of saying, you know what, I'm going to go from, or I'm just going to do the whiteout today, and tomorrow I'm going to take the article from Joy Hakeem's book. So, all of those are potential ways that you could break down the supporting questions and the sources that they're going to read as part of an inquiry. I see in the chat, Molly had a question. When adapting a C3 teacher's inquiry this spring, I found it challenging to cut down the suggested time to a handful of remote ones. Do you have any recommendations for how to better do this? My thinking along those lines was that you would still try to do a week to kind of sink into things, and then maybe another half week to actually work on the project. But that was me in my office thinking that, and I think it depends on the inquiry. So if you found one of those really long ones, I would suggest taking a look at what sources maybe aren't quite as necessary, or some of them tend to repeat a source over and over again. There's quite a few out there that you'll read the same thing just for a different purpose each day. Maybe you highlight that a little bit less. I'm hopeful this is helping in some way, shape, or form. I think that ultimately it's going to depend on the inquiry, but letting some of those pieces go. Maybe if you feel like the sources are good, maybe shorten the performance task at the end. But all of those would be some solutions off the top of my head. So yes, you were on the right track. Cool. So in analyzing the sources, again, some of these things I said on the previous slide, but encourage students to read and interpret them using strategies practiced in class. Remote learning is probably not a time to introduce a new reading strategy that you've never done before. I would go hot and heavy with a couple throughout the school year, and then have them remind them you should be talking to the text even though we're not in class, or tonight if you're in a blended class, tonight I want you to go home and read this source and annotate it, and I want you to come back the next morning and show it to us so we can talk about what it was that you read. And encourage rereading. Rereading is a strategy it's in everything. You know, very few of us read something once. I haven't read these books just once, and you can tell by the number of notes I've jotted in the corners and how dog-eared some of them are. But we as adults naturally think to reread, and our adolescent students or our elementary students don't necessarily think to do that right off the bat. You know, they would much prefer to do a one and done and move out of the realm of reading this particular primary source to get on to the next one. So encourage them to reread. You could, if I go back to that Google Classroom topic piece, you could have the documents organized as a course pack underneath each topic and subtopic. And again, schedule online readings, record yourself, provide video links. If it's that's another way you can shorten things, Molly, is if it's someone delivering a speech and there's an actual recording of the speech, include that, use that. You know, that's there for you already. Give them a link to that and have them watch it. Sometimes that's even more powerful, especially when I think of some of the stories that could be captured from the civil rights movement for a high school US history teacher. Might be more powerful to hear the person speak the words than it would be to just read them on the page. So all of these are in the overall document. I'm going to move into the final two pieces here. And the first one of those is building an argument. So reading the sources comprises the bulk of your inquiry time, whether it's in a remote setting, a blended setting, or a classroom setting. But you don't generally just say, okay, you've read these things, now answer a question. Kids need practice. Kids need to be encouraged through this step. And again, that's a little bit easier to do in a blended setting where you can send them home to do something and, you know, utilize some of those same videos that you might come up with in class and have time with them in class to go over their argument. That may not be as feasible in a remote setting. So, but building an argument is the fun part. I really like an evidence chart like this one, which came out of a C3 inquiry. I just could not tell you which one, but it's pretty bare bones in terms of it's not specific to any one inquiry. And so this one could easily be taken and used in your class. So if your compelling question is written at the top above evidence chart, you know, this sort of breaks it down for them in a way that will hopefully lead them to having all the evidence to put this together, either in paper form or any other form that they choose, you know, from that unpacking the task slide in step 2. So a graphic organizer like this one works. A teacher created graphic organizer. If you feel like this is too loose for your kids, absolutely, you know, create your own, use this as a model or start to fill things in. I often, when writing with my students, with my special ed students in general, I had a very structured outline that I used to use that was almost fill in the blank. I feel this way, blank, because blank, you know, just to really encourage them to get to the heart of what they know and what they think and what they feel about it, rather than them getting bogged down in, oh crap, I've got to write a paper for Johnson again. You can have, both in a remote and blended setting, have students connect with buddies virtually. Some LMSs have that built in. Others, you know, they can Zoom, they can Facebook message chat as well. You know, there's tons of avenues for that, but have them partner up and have them actually connect with buddies to, you know, fill in a evidence chart like this one or one that you come up with digitally together. You know, group work doesn't have to just be group work in the classroom. And even if we're 6 feet apart, you know, you can be much further than that in a virtual setting and still have meaningful group work. So as far as arguing the answer, before you have them actually communicate their conclusions, which is the next and final set of slides here, have them actually come up with what they think about it so that they know what sorts of things they need to include when they get to that final step. So communicating conclusions is the final step of the C3 framework, and it's the final step of my 6-part how to adapt an inquiry for online, remote, or blended learning. And you know, essentially this goes back to a previous slide that talked about what sorts of things can you do. You might review with students all the things you could do, create a website, create a podcast, create a video, but at some point, find some way to present these. What's great about a well done inquiry when your kids go off is that you don't. I did this to myself every single year. I assigned, because we were a writing across the curriculum school, I assigned a paper on the Revolutionary War for my eighth graders. It was always due the day before Thanksgiving. Because it gave me plenty of time to avoid my in-laws at Thanksgiving dinner. Oh, sorry, I got 142 papers to grade. But this, I ended up reading the same paper 142 times because of the way it's structured, and with a really good, compelling question, and the flexibility to not just do a paper. I mean, if you go back to step 5, the argument piece of it is going to be enough for a lot of kids. Finding a fun way to communicate conclusions in a remote, blended, or in-person setting is just going to make grading papers that much more enjoyable, because you're not going to see the same thing 142 times. So schedule an online showcase, invite students and families. So if you're remote, go this route. Invite students and families to participate in the remote showcase. Come up with some kind of structured order, from 6:15 to 6:20. Johnny's going to do this presentation. Let parents come in, treat it like a digital open house, and see what other kids are doing in class for their, for their inquiry, for their presentation. You can go the boring route either way, whether blended or in remote or in person, and have students turn their work in via your learning management system. You can have them email and share it to you via Google Drive and YouTube. Drop projects off during a meal run. How you go this route, just get creative, because it's super fun. I did not practice inquiry when I was teaching because C3 wasn't around. I mean, I practiced components of it, but I didn't practice C3 components. But I have seen teachers across my zone flock towards inquiry as an instructional method, and they have shown me and told me so many amazing things about what they have been able to accomplish and what their kids have done with it. So get creative with this. If you have to, go the online showcase route. Maybe do it regardless of whether there's a shutdown. An online showcase is a great feather in your district's cap for an annual report each year. Seeing that brings along some of that family school engagement that we all talk about. So I'm wrapping this up here. Molly mentioned that she had tried this already. I'm not going to put Molly on the spot, but are there any other Mollys out there who may have come across the handout from which this was presented or created from, and tried adapting an inquiry for the COVID-19 shutdown? And if so, anyone want to share how it went, or what lessons you may have about how it went that you want to share with the group overall? Going to practice an appropriate amount of wait time to see if anything pops up in chat. Learned that from my friend Stan Masters. Oh, Amanda says, haven't been able to do any C3 inquiries, but I have found that throwing in higher order opinion questions up participation. That's good. Google makes it easy for students to pair up and work together. Some of my students from different hours enjoyed getting to work to absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm going to wind this presentation down. Like I said, you all have access to the handout that this was built from, and the digital recap of this will be available on the MCSS website, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow, and we'll also include a link to it. So if you don't have it, or if you've lost it already, don't worry, that'll be included there as well. But if you have any questions for me about this in the future, my email address is on this slide, and I welcome the further conversation. Kay Hoffman says Flipgrid is another great way for students to showcase their conclusions. Absolutely. I have participated in and run a couple of Flipgrids during the COVID-19 shutdown. And it's great if you are a verbalizer like me, who likes to talk, because you just set your webcam down, or you just sit down in front of your webcam and record your answer. And you can record other answers to you can record reactions to other people's answers as well, so it's kind of neat. Cassandra says DBQ Project has provided great inquiry questions. Absolutely. The DBQ Project is a partner with MCSS as well. We've done several events together over the last few years. They're always a huge sponsor of our conference. Absolutely love the DBQ Project and their materials, and they're absolutely fantastic inquiry questions. Definitely very close to the definition of compelling. So, well, the Michigan Council for Social Studies appreciates all of your time and all of your attention this evening. We look forward to continuing our conversations next week as we finish up the webinar series. Like I mentioned before, this presentation will be up on the MCSS website as well as the statewide Social Studies Collaborative website, www.misocialstudies.org. I'm going to write that in the chat. And you can keep the Learning Today going by tweeting at us at MCSS Info or visiting our Facebook page. Once again, you can join MCSS anytime and you'll have access to professional development opportunities, publications, and other fun resources, all for only $40 a year. But on behalf of our board, who's listed here, I'd like to once again thank you all for coming, and I wish you all a fantastic week ahead. Have a great week, everybody.
Can we all give Dave a virtual round of applause and thank you?
My pleasure.